over the last 2 years in the context of what could be described as a global upsurge in Black Lives Matter, the BLM demonstrations. The upsurge, particularly in June 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, an African American, at the hands of a white American police officer, is not an expression of a new grievance in response to police violence against Black communities in the US, but an ongoing protest and forms of resistance against devaluing of Black lives, one which resonates across the world. In the immediate aftermath of the demonstrations, alongside criticisms of BLM, for example, in relation to the defacing and toppling of statues, there was an outpouring of support that heralded the current moment as unprecedented and as a catalyst towards achieving racial justice. However, these claims, including from academics, did not sit well with me. It was not enough for academics in particular to say that it just feels different. For me, the concept of the arc of history presents an opportunity to challenge what has been described as a type of presentism in the analysis of racial phenomena that fails to engage effectively, firstly, with a long history of critical thinking around race and racism for Black people and other people of color, including Indigenous people groups. And secondly, with the historical processes, the social, political, and cultural struggles over racial meaning that have produced the current moment. My initial response for taking forward my thinking in this area has led to conversations and interventions that explore the synergies between historical and sociological analysis. I have particularly done this in collaboration with Dr. Chris Jefferson, who is based in the history department at Cambridge. This seminar series is an opportunity to explore how other academics pick up the concept of the arc of history for discussing and informing their work. The aim is for us to learn together as we seek to shed analytical light on how processes of race and racism continue to have profound effect in our world. The session format will be as follows. Professor Modood will speak for around 30 minutes. Then Amina Shareef, a reorganizer and a doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge, exploring the intersection between state violence and street violence directed towards Muslim people in the context of the war on terror, will then open up the conversation with Professor Modood before handing over to you, the audience, for questions. I will now hand over to Amina, who will introduce Professor Modood.
Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. So as someone who's had the privilege and pleasure of thinking with Tariq Modood over the years, I really feel honored to be moderating this talk. So Professor Modood specializes in the theory and politics of racism. I don't know if you can hear some background noise. No? Okay. Professor Modood specializes in the theory and politics of racism, racial equality, multiculturalism, and secularism, with special reference to British Muslim Asians. He is the founding director of the Bristol University Research Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. He has held over 40 grants and consultancies, had over 35 co-authored and co-edited books and reports, and over 275 articles or chapters in political philosophy, sociology, and public policy. He is the co-founding editor of the international journal Ethnicities, and his work is frequently cited by policymakers and practitioners, and on several occasions has influenced policy. So an amazing biography. Thank you, Professor Modood, for being with us today. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amina. And thank you, Sharon, and the rest of the Arc of History team for this invitation, which I know Sharon knows that when she first invited me, I kind of scratched my head and, metaphorically speaking, and said, well, I don't know what to say about that. But I'm glad she persisted because actually it's kind of stimulated me to think about things that I don't normally think about, or that are just below the level of what I might think about. And so it's forced me to compose this talk. So this is a totally new talk. It's not something I've pulled out of my filing cabinet or out of the computer. And the other thing that will become very evident very quickly is that it's not really a scholarly talk, but I like to think there's quite a lot of food for thought in relation to the arc of history in it. Let me begin with 3 facts that are part of my arc of history. Firstly, my ancestors came from Afghanistan and Central Asia to India a few hundred years ago. They were Muslim, and much later, some for idealistic reasons, but in any case to escape the slaughter of Muslims in Delhi, they fled to Pakistan in 1947, when Pakistan was created. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan. This is my now second fact. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, but lived there only 8 years. Thirdly, in 1961, my parents brought me and my two sisters to London, and I've ever since lived in Britain. Those are three simple facts. I'd like to reflect on them, especially on what they mean in terms of how I should relate to them politically and in terms of identity and belonging. That involves, as in the title of this talk, thinking about two empires and two countries: the Mughal Empire of India, the British Empire, Pakistan, and Britain. When I say reflect on the three facts, I may be overstating what I offer. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say I'm raising questions without being able to answer them. Insofar as the talk has any intellectual pretensions, it may be that I'm raising questions that others are not, or I'm suggesting that the questions are more complex than some others might, especially more activist-led perspectives framed in terms of conflict and binaries. I suppose the grandest claim I might make is that some of the questions I'm posing cannot be explored within the leading ways of thinking about race and decolonization. So, beginning with the first fact. It seems from some family trees, genealogies, in possession of my family, that my father's side of the family came to India at quite an early period in the Mughal conquest of India, and went on to be part of the Mughal rule in northern India, ultimately centered in Delhi. I would guess they were involved in fighting and bloodshed and would have suffered losses, but clearly they were on the winning side. They went on to be part of a hierarchical and imperial system of ruling, subject to the decision of those higher up in the hierarchy, but nevertheless part of a privileged elite. And for all I know, they had racial or quasi-racial attitudes to some others, especially to some or all of the subject populations. They were soldiers, administrators, and scholars. One, Shah Waliullah, being probably the most eminent Muslim theologian of India. And so they contributed to a political order and a magnificent culture. The culture that, for example, produced the Taj Mahal. So what should be my attitude to those ancestors? Should I be ashamed that they were conquerors and rulers and supported a system in which thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, were commanded to labor to build an enormous marble bejeweled mausoleum to a dead queen, namely the Taj Mahal? Rightly or wrongly, and of course, I'm very happy to discuss this. Rightly or wrongly, I'm actually proud of them, of the political order and the civilization they helped to create and sustain. And I think of that history and cultural heritage as not just one of the grand periods of Indian history and of the making of modern India, but of my history and of my cultural heritage. Even though I feel that the current Hindu nationalism wants to erase or marginalize it, to deny that it is truly Indian, or that it is truly mine, or worse still, that Muslims in India today are truly Indian and helped to create India, but as this extreme nationalism regards them as invaders, destroyers, and oppressors. So, moving on to the next phase in this arc of history. The British arrived in India, originally as traders, but as we all know, they took over the place and created an empire. That means they dispossessed my ancestors of their empire, should I say our empire, and of their or our land, wealth, and privileges. The Mughal Empire was broken up and the British took over, benefiting mightily in the process in terms not just of wealth, but in becoming a world power and a master race. My ancestors were involved in the big uprising of 1857, and they were crushed. Some lost their lives, others lost their land and status. There is, however, a twist here. Up to now, I've been talking about my paternal ancestors. My maternal ancestors also came to India from northern Afghanistan or Central Asia, maybe somewhere around Bukhara, and so ethnically were the same. But they came much later, somewhere in the 18th century, at a time when the Mughal rulers were clearly in decline and the British were becoming dominant. In that situation, they preferred to work with the British rather than against them. And doing so, they flourished, coming to rule a small state within the growing British orbit. So what should I think of the British? That they came and destroyed and marginalized the power and status of my paternal ancestors, or that they enabled my maternal ancestors to be a privileged elite? And what of British racism? My father, born shortly after the First World War in Delhi, where he lived the first third of his life, ironically leaving for Pakistan when the British Raj departed. My father can remember, I mean, he's passed away now. My father could remember when British clubs had signs outside saying, "No dogs or Indians." He and my extended family, and I'm now talking about people in my life, not simply historical ancestors, were a racialized and subject population. My family fled from Delhi in 1947 in fear of their lives and women fearing rape or sexual assault. Though refugees fleeing with only what they could carry, they in due course were able to create a middle-class life in Pakistan. I was 8 when I left Pakistan for good, and in the subsequent 60+ years have spent limited time there, though including one very formative number of months there and in India, looking for my roots, taking a year out from my postgraduate studies. While I have extended family all over the world, a multi-continental diaspora, the majority are in Pakistan. My dad, who spent only 14 of his 86 years in Pakistan and was in many ways a great admirer of many things British, and as a devout Muslim, came to despair of Pakistan, which he said was less ethically Islamic than Britain, and expressly said he did not wish to be buried in Pakistan and wasn't. So how should I feel about Pakistan? Well, I do feel connected to it, love and hate things about it, and don't like to see it criticized or get a bad press. It can, though, be difficult to take pride in the connection. When I think what Pakistan could have achieved in its 75-year history compared to what it has. And when I see that most forms of inequalities and attitudes of superiority that I'm against are more prevalent in Pakistan than in Britain. So that then brings me to Britain. Yeah, just checking, don't have the papers in the wrong order. Given that nearly all my life and virtually all my education and intellectual formation has been in Britain, and English, not Urdu, has long been my primary language, it is evident that I've been more shaped by Britain and the British Empire than any other place I have or can mention. And so I'm clearly much more British than I am anything else. And this is not just an external sociological fact about me, it is also an internal fact about me. Namely, it is what I think and feel. It is part of my being. So I would strongly resist any racist or anti-racist that denied that I was British, that I was entitled to say who I say I am. In relation to the specifics of my biography, I actually gave a talk to this university just a month ago, and it's available on YouTube, so I won't go into that. If you want more details, please see the video of that talk. The organizers have a link. Maybe one of you could put it in the chat, or if someone wants to email me afterwards, please do so. Except that I'll just say something about my experience as a racialized Briton, very, very briefly. In that talk, I describe how in my childhood and teenage years, I was bullied or abused as an Asian or a Pakistani. This was the time of Paki bashing. But as an adult, and especially the last 30 years, I've been discriminated and othered as a Muslim. So please see the video if you want to know more about that, or of course, it can come up in the discussion. In relation to the arc of history, I would say that I became part of the British story, not when I landed on these shores, but when the British started taking over the India of my ancestors. When they started encroaching upon and ultimately destroying the empire of my paternal ancestors, while incorporating and rewarding my maternal ancestors. So I welcome the new emphasis on including British global exploits and imperial history into school and university curricula, so that people like me, and in particular, any grandchildren I may come to have, and other children like them, can see the long arc of history that made them British. A history of slavery, racial subordination, and imperial rule, but also a history in which ideas of equality, citizenship, and multicultural Britishness could also emerge and develop and contest racialization and exclusion. A history of empires won and lost, and the making of a future in which all can have a sense of belonging to the country. I hope it is evident how this connects with some current thinking and activism around decolonisation. I would, however, like to end the talk by making some general remarks, urging us not to have too narrow a view of decolonisation, of, for example, not taking a Eurocentric view of decolonisation. That is to say, of only focusing on Europe and America, or of seeing the world only in terms of a Euro-American framework, as if racism and colonization only took place in or by the West, only by Westerners. We should be able to critically engage with older empires, like the Mughals, or much older, like the Egyptians or the Chinese, or indeed recent transmutations of empire, like the way the Russian Empire became the Soviet Union with an even more expansive imperium. I actually have a personal interest in that particular history too. If you remember, I mentioned that my ancestors came from Central Asia. Just as they became part of the British story, so the ones who remained behind in Central Asia were conquered by the Russians and became part of the Russian story. And another part were absorbed by the Chinese Empire, which in due course transmuted into the People's Republic of China. If a decolonizing perspective is not able to shine a light, an analytical as well as an activist light, on what is happening to the Uyghurs at the moment in Xinjiang, then it is indeed too narrow. It is what I mean by a Eurocentric decolonization perspective. Similarly with racism, we have in the last couple of decades come to appreciate that racism is not just of the biologically causally determinant type, not just about phenotypes or even about color. Rather, that biological descent or ancestral descent can be used to create, to racialize and other subject populations, to marginalize and oppress through cultural racisms like Islamophobia. In the next couple of decades, we need to use these insights to identify, analyze, and critique such racialization wherever it exists in the world, and especially where no white people are present. With Thomas Seeley, I'm currently finalizing a special issue for the journal Political Quarterly entitled Racisms and Anti-Racism in Asia and the Middle East. It includes articles on Arab racism in the Gulf, on casteism in Pakistan, on Islamophobia in India, Israeli racism against Palestinians, on discrimination against the Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia, as well as Chinese racism against Africans and against the Uyghur people. So I'll hope you look out for that. It should come out in a few months' time. And I hope it'll offer some substance to my plea to not limit ourselves to a narrow Eurocentric view of racism, empires, and decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Modood, for that very stimulating reflection of your personal biography and relationship with empires. And I guess I want to start off by connecting connecting your conversation with, the work that you're doing right now. You have been, intellectually invested for decades now with the idea of multiculturalism, and here in Britain in particular. You recently, proposed this idea of secularized multiculturalism, or yes, multiculturalized secularism. Sorry, I knew I had that inverted.
Well, actually,
yes, multiculturalized secularism. Can you just tell us what your vision of multiculturalized secularism means in terms of how it can offer a way forward for sort of meeting the demands that have been sort of raised by the BLM mobilization that are, of course, part of this larger arc of history?
Yeah, okay, that's a slightly complicated subject. I'll see if I can say something useful about it in a brief response. So one's got to begin with a little bit of background about what is secularism before one can talk about multiculturalizing it. So about that, I just briefly say two things. Firstly, I'm only interested in, I am only working on political secularism. So secularism can mean lots of other things. For some people, it means atheism and things like that. So it has a metaphysical meaning. Sociologists talk about secularization to do with how people lead their lives. So those are two things I'm not looking at. I'm only interested in political norms, political structures, and political arrangements. So that's one important thing. But within that, there used to be a view, and it's now, luckily, some of us have been resisting it, so it's now in retreat, but it's not by any means absent, especially outside non-specialists. There is a view that secularism is about the separation of church and state. So I think that is too simplistic. Similarly, there are other people who think that secularism is about freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. And I think that too is too simplistic. Secularism is about the relationship between political authority and religious authority. And it is the view that political authority must not be subordinated to religious authority. But that leaves it wide open to lots of different interpretations and lots of different institutional variations. Why I say that is the beginning or the base of secularism rather than something like freedom of conscience is that I want to be able to say, as the Soviets said of themselves, that the Soviet Union was a secular state, but it wasn't a state where there was freedom of worship. So to be a secular state doesn't mean to have freedom of worship. Of course, to be a liberal secular state is to have freedom of worship. So what about multiculturalizing secularism? So the next move I make is I say that if we look at a country like Britain, and we're not exceptional in this respect, Western Europe and perhaps other parts of Europe are very similar, and perhaps other parts of the world, I can't pretend to have studied them all. We are neither like US secularism, which says it has a constitutional wall of separation between church and state, because we clearly don't have such a wall of separation. The Anglican Church is tied to the British state and vice versa in all kinds of ways. But nor are we like the other well-known political secularism, namely laïcité of the French Republic, because we don't try and control religion in the public space, trying to, as it were, push it out of the public space. All the fuss and the hysteria there's been in France about women wearing headscarves in schools, wearing the niqab in public places, Muslims praying in the street, and so on. So I say that the kind of secularism we have in Britain, because I want to say we are a secular state, is what I call moderate secularism, where there can be some connections between church and state, but where the connections are largely in order to serve the public good. So the connections don't exist necessarily for a theological purpose or a metaphysical purpose, or even because people are obliged to believe in it. So the Church of England is part of the UK state, but the UK state doesn't require anyone to believe anything about God or to not believe anything about God. But nevertheless, there is this institutional connection. So moderate secularism can have these connections and does have these connections. And I'm sorry it's taking so long to answer your question, but you just asked me a question that is impossible to answer without having said what I've said so far. So now I finally get to multiculturalizing it. So a lot of people, about the dominant liberal view, in Britain and many other places is that the best way of accommodating or supporting religious diversity, including ethno-religious diversity or racialized religious diversity, is by having a neutral state, i.e. being more like the United States, by disestablishing the Church of England and the Lutheran Church in Denmark and in Norway and so on. And I say, no, that's not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is about inclusion, not about dispossession. So Anglicans don't have to lose anything, but they do have to share something. They have to share in some form or another their institutional privileges. They have to, what is offered by the state to the Church of England or to Christians and Jews more generally should also be offered to Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs if they want it. No one should be compelled to have anything they don't want. So for instance, we should be able to have not just Christian worship in schools, but also Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Sikh, if the children and or the parents want it, depending on the age of the children, the parents will clearly have a say. So that's different from those who say, oh no, a multicultural secular school is one where we only study religion, we don't worship. I say no. Multicultural school is where people are allowed to express themselves in terms of their identities that are important to them, including minority identities, cultural and religious identities. So I've probably taken such a long time to get to the point, but that very briefly is what I mean by multiculturalizing secularism rather than liberalizing it.
Thank you for that discussion. I think it was really useful to help understand, how you have evolved over time in your sort of conceptualization of multiculturalism. I just want to ask one more question before we open it to the floor then. You use the language of ethno-religious groups, and this is a departure from viewing religious people as simply practicing freedom of conscience. And it sort of brings together the idea that they're practicing this, but at the same time, they're also racialized by perceptions of what such and such religion is. In some of your previous work, you wrote about the asymmetries in legislation in terms of a protection from blasphemy. This was in your work on the Salman Rushdie affair. And here we are about 25 years later in 2022, and we still have these asymmetries in the laws. Specifically, as an example, you have incitement to racial hatred laws that are very easy to fulfill in terms of the threshold that has to be met before the laws are applied versus incitement to religious hatred. So coming back now to finally the question and what I mentioned earlier about ethno-religious groups, do you think it would be sort of an important direction to take to sort of shift the language entirely away from religion and talk about racial groups, racialized groups, because clearly we understand and we accept that they're racialized. So why do we need to keep using this language of religion?
Yeah. Actually, just on a factual matter, Amina, apart from the example that you chose just now about incitement to religious hatred versus incitement to racial hatred, actually, UK law now is pretty square on race and religion, because the Equality Act of 2010 had a number of grounds, race and religion being two, but there was gender, disability, age, and so on. And it kind of applies uniformly, but it doesn't cover incitement to hatred. So you're right about that. Of course, that's the law, But in practice, we don't treat anti-racism in the same way that we treat, for instance, religious discrimination or Islamophobia. So in my own university, if we look at what's happening and so on, action against Islamophobia, even discussion about Islamophobia, is very marginal compared to the increasingly prominent place we give to anti-Black racism. So that asymmetry, as you said, does exist in political ways, but less so in legal ways. As for the term ethno-religious and talking about race rather than religion, first of all, I'm not really in favor of binaries like we should only talk about religion or only talk about race. We need to talk about both. I think there's enough evidence to show that the ways that people are discriminated against, stereotyped, racialized, othered, can have both racial and religious dimensions combined. I think the classic case, and this is really what I mean by the ethno-religious, the idea of the ethno-religious, the classic case are Jews in Europe. Here's a group, a very old, ancient group with an ancient religion, but they're not just a religion. Lots of Jews wear their religion as it were very lightly. Some are even proud atheists and so on. Some have a Jewish identity that's based not around religion, but around the memory of the Holocaust or Israel and so on. So by ethno-religious, I mean a group of people who have a sense of being a people, who have a religion, but who are not all religious, or who can't be reduced to the one dimension of religion, and of course, who are also racialized by others to whom they react in various ways, asserting their identity and so on. And I think that's what we've seen in Britain. The first of the non-white groups to be in that position were the Sikhs in their battle over recognition of the turban, of men wearing turbans, for instance, in places of work, against policies that said you shouldn't wear a turban or you should wear a workplace uniform in schools and so on. But obviously the very big case of the last couple of decades have been claims made by Muslims, and it's not confined to this country as well. So I wouldn't like to say, oh, let's stop talking about religion because the important thing is race, but nor do I want to say, let's stop talking about race because the important thing is religion. For groups like Muslims, these things are both important. Some Muslims do experience racialization and marginalization and abuse, including in public places and so on, because of aspects of their faith. For instance, if they wear a headscarf like you're wearing. But there are other people who don't look particularly Muslim, like me. I could be a Hindu or a Sikh or something, Parsi. But I may still experience discrimination because people think I'm a Muslim, or when they see my name, or when the context makes it clear that I'm a Muslim, even though there may be nothing religious about me. So Muslims get discriminated both because of their faith and because they're Muslims, regardless of anything we know about whether they believe or not. And the worst case example we have of that are Bosnian Muslims. When the Serbs, we talk about ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, when the Serbs came into Bosnian villages and rounded up people, some of whom ended up in concentration camps, some of whom lost their lives, others were expelled from their places, of where they lived, their homes. They didn't ask anybody to recite the kalma. They didn't ask anybody, what do you believe? It wasn't like the Spanish Grand Inquisition. They targeted those groups of people because they were Muslim by descent and by community. So they racialized them as Muslims rather than, as it were, religionized them. But they did pick them out because they were Muslims. So here, race and religion work together, and a good, effective analysis, as well as effective anti-racist strategies, must take them together and not separate them out and not reduce one to the other.
Thank you for that. So I will now move into the questions that are appearing in the chat. Our first question is from Samina, and she's asking, what, if any, is the difference between political imperatives to undo the colonial imperialist legacies of Western European empires versus other empires throughout time?
The what imperatives? Did you say practical imperative or scholarly imperative?
Between political imperatives. So what, if any, is the difference?
Political imperatives, yeah. So obviously the politics varies from place to place and from time to time. So for us, say in Britain, or wherever most of us are who are participating in this session, I imagine decolonizing the British colonial legacy and achieving proper racial equality and multicultural Britishness would be a greater priority than thinking about, let's say, the Persian Empire. But I mean, looking at world events, we can see how Chinese imperial thinking and practice is very strongly evident and on a much larger scale than anything we can see in Britain or Western Europe or the United States. I'm talking, of course, about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, which a lot of Uyghurs who've managed to escape are describing as genocide, either as physical genocide or cultural genocide. So if we look at scale, and with political imperative, scale is one thing we obviously do think about. Think about Islamophobia. It's on such a larger scale in India than it is in Britain. I mean, if you think about how many lives are lost to Islamophobic violent attacks, I mean, obviously, even if we controlled for population sizes, it's going to be a lot more. It is a lot more in India. I mean, we had very serious riots in Delhi, in New Delhi, just about a year and a half ago, just over a year ago. And there've been so many reported incidents. And I don't know whether some of you are aware, but about a month ago, there was a meeting in Hardivar in northern India of some kind of cultural nationalist organization, Hindutva type organization. I don't know whether it was BJP or some other organization. And it was recorded, and speakers from the podium openly talked about reducing the number of Muslims, that there were too many Muslims in India. And the solution might have to be something like the one that Hitler devised for the Jews. I mean, that is absolutely frightening. I mean, that was rhetoric, but we know in India that action follows rhetoric. When politicians spread Islamophobia by word of mouth and by social media, and actually not just social media, even mainstream media in India now, riots and violence, lynchings take place. So my answer to that question is, of course, it depends on one's context. If I'm a citizen of Britain, I'm going to be obviously more concerned about getting things sorted in Britain. But nevertheless, scale is another political consideration, because we obviously focus on where we think the problems are worst or getting bad just as we also think about what we can do, what we ourselves or people we're organized with can do. So that would be my answer.
We have another question coming in from Daphne. I suppose I'm just reading them out, but Daphne, if you are interested in reading your question, you're welcome to do so as well.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real privilege to have you. I think my question actually relates to some of the other questions which are in the chat, I first appreciated the reflexivity of your presentation and wondering how we can encourage others to also reflect on their personal arcs of history in relation to the wider historical context. And I know someone else had asked, thinking specifically in school context, how can we help students do that sort of thing? So thank you.
Well, I don't know whether I've got any original thing to say about that. Obviously, what the history curriculum includes would be very relevant. And as I mentioned, in passing my talk, I think that the British history curriculum should be not just about what's sometimes called the island story. It should be about the British global story, or the British imperial story, including slavery and various trades connected to slavery and its legacy. What literature is read, what fiction is read, what drama is engaged in. I also think that, and this relates to the conversation I was having with Amina, that I think including something on religion, more than British schools now do. At the moment, British schools, I don't think, do include a lot on religion. They're actually obliged to by law, but on the whole, the law is not enforced. I think knowing something more about why religion matters to various people, that it matters to, is quite important, because as a society, it's quite clear that religion doesn't matter to us a lot as a society. And so to people to whom it does matter then seem oddities. They seem like freaks. It doesn't seem so bad to think of them as kind of second-class citizens. So I think we need a lot more what's called religious literacy. And of course, this should be on a kind of multi-faith basis, because it shouldn't be just about one particular religion and so on. I think that schools taking racial equality seriously, as I think quite a lot of schools do, but it's always a matter of degree. It's an evolving, a moving program of development and activities, but taking that more seriously in not just the curriculum subject, but in how people are referred to, treated, respected. So I don't know whether that answer is a bit too general for you, but you did, Daphne, ask me a very general question.
I think we're quite happy with that answer.
Okay.
So there's another question coming in from Abhishek Diaz. It connects to some of the response that you gave with regards to Samina's question on political imperative. I'm going to read the question out anyway, in case you have something else to add. Yeah. He asks, Mughal and you mentioned two empires, the Mughal and British. India witnessed high levels of violence from both groups of outsiders. How would you distinguish the violence of these two groups? And how does that inform the current forms of structural violence prevalent in the Indian subcontinent?
Yeah, well, to some extent, I think I did touch on this a moment ago when I said that the violence against Muslims, and more generally, the oppression against Muslims, is much more severe, has become much more severe, but historically has been more severe than against Muslims in Britain. So how would you distinguish them? Well, I guess one way I would distinguish them is that the current government of India and its predecessor BJP administration doesn't seem to take Islamophobia at all seriously. In fact, that's an understatement. It seems to be one of the forces for spreading Islamophobia. And often evidence shows, including, for instance, those riots in New Delhi that I mentioned a little while ago, of about sort of 15 months or so ago, evidence shows that the police are often complicit in the violence and also engaged in brutality themselves, either openly at the time of violence or later when they arrest the victims and then brutalize the victims. I think our present government, especially the Conservative Party and the Conservative government, doesn't take Islamophobia at all seriously either, but you couldn't put them on the same scale as Narendra Modi's government.
I'm a bit speechless at that point because because you brought together these two parties and just trying to think about what it would look like to actually say that in the same breath.
You know what the question was asking me to do?
No, you're absolutely right.
He does say he can elaborate if he wants to. I'm happy to hear the elaboration. But wasn't he asking me to make that comparison?
Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you for elaborating your remarks.
Yeah. I mean, I should just say, if it sounds like I'm saying that, oh, Boris Johnson, no, he's not really an obstacle to taking Islamophobia seriously, that he condones Islamophobia. And in fact, he's written stuff and so on which directly contributes to Islamophobic attitudes in the country, specifically about Muslim women's headdress and the niqab. Well, I'm not saying that, but if someone says, please make a comparison between the Indian subcontinent and here, then I respond as I do.
Yes, thank you. And we do have evidence that the Conservative Party is dragging its feet in terms of instating the APPG definition of Islamophobia and sort of commissioning another investigation that's not internal, that doesn't lead to something like the Singh report.
I mean, there is a report just published today by someone who was a former research associate of mine. We worked together on a project. His name is Stephen Jones. He's just published, co-authored a report on Islamophobia, published today. If you were to Google using his name or look on Twitter, I'm sure you'd find it. I haven't read it, just came out today, but looking at the tweets, it looks very interesting and very informative.
I'll make note of that. Thank you. So we have another question here from Janet. I think it might be our last question. So she says, my academic interests include religion and education. A daily act of worship remains a legal requirement in schools in England, as you yourself mentioned. This has been challenged across the educational establishment and by interfaith groups for decades for the reasons you give. However, the more nuanced understanding of secularism, which I believe she might be referencing the multiculturalized secularism, and the critique you give of laïcité aren't winning hearts and minds in public opinion. Any suggestions?
Yes, yes. I fear you may be right, Janet. So when I first started writing on this, I was just, a little bit ahead of the curve. So it was in the 1990s. And when opinion polls, like say the British Attitude Survey, when opinion polls asked people in Britain of their attitude to religion, like, do they think, for instance, there's too much or too little in our public life? The majority of people, not an overwhelming majority, but a clear majority of people, let's say between around 55 to 60%, that sort of number, said no, they didn't think there was too much religion in public space, or they didn't think that religion was doing more harm than good. Those kinds of questions, just trying to remember roughly. Unfortunately, the answers to those or similar questions have been moving away from positive answers saying no, they're not doing harm, to ones where now at least half the country, it's much more evenly divided, at least half the country thinks that religion today in Britain is doing more harm than good. So yes, there is a shift. And I think, it is a shift that's very strongly correlated, in fact, I'd say connected to the prominence of Muslims, of Muslim causes, and above all, I suppose, Islamist terrorism. So as those things have become more prominent, attitudes to Muslims have got worse because people tend to blame the group rather than the individuals carrying out terrorist actions and so on. But one of the knock-on effects of that is that people become more unsympathetic to religion, not just Islam and Muslims, but to religion more generally, it seems, from this trend. So you're right that we're not winning hearts and minds in public opinion. I was a member of the Commission on Religion in Public Life in Britain that published about 5 years or perhaps 6, 7 years ago. And one of the things we discussed was what you're asking about what should, if any, be the place of religious instruction and worship in state schools, in what Americans would call public schools, but we would call state schools. And we were a little bit divided on the subject because some people thought it should have no place in state schools. It could exist, obviously, in faith schools, like Christian, Muslim, or Jewish schools, but not in state schools, which, of course, are the majority of the schools in the country. And what should be in state schools should only be religious education, not instruction. I did not favor that view for reasons I gave earlier, that I think if something's important to people, we should find space for it in our schools. We shouldn't tell people, no, this is a private matter, go and do it in the mosque or at the temple or in your community. But we came up with a compromise formula, and that is, we said that religious instruction and religious worship should be permitted and accommodated in school premises. Head teacher should allow it, perhaps should even encourage it. Maybe there'd be a club or something, but that it should take place outside the curriculum. So it would take place, say, at lunchtime or after school or on a Saturday. So this is religious instruction and worship. Religious education, we insisted, should be a compulsory element of the curriculum, which oddly, it isn't. We have religious worship, which is broadly Christian worship, is compulsory but is not honored in law. Is not honored in practice. Compulsory by law, not honored in practice, not enforced by anybody. But religious education is left to the discretion of the school. And we wanted to turn it the other way around. We said, let's make religious education compulsory for the reasons I was giving before about religious illiteracy. But I also said, as a commission, we said this compromise position that religious worship and religious instruction should also be possible in state schools, but outside a formal timetable. So that's a kind of compromise which I like to think fits the current mood, which has been moving away from broadly sympathetic of religion in public and in state schools to far less sympathetic, and possibly may continue to drift further if we don't more strongly make a case that religious people, religious communities, people for whom their religious identities are important in the way that I was explaining in the case of Jews, for instance, that they have a right to have the schools that are funded out of the public purse, out of the taxes we all pay, to reflect their their sense of importance in relation to their identities and what it is to be themselves.
Thank you. I think that we're going to have to end there, unfortunately, because we've come right up to the hour and we've just popped over the top. But I just want to thank yourself, Professor Modood, for a fantastic talk. I know I'm going to go back and listen. I really loved how you opened up just by tracing your own story, the kind of stories of empire and how the complexity that we need to bring as we're thinking about these issues. And then also thank you very much to Amina for asking some very challenging questions, I think, and also for those in kind of participants and your contribution. Just to say that our next talk is on the 8th of February, and that will be with Professor Kahinda Andrews. We will have the information out about the kind of details of the talk and also where to sign up for that, hopefully in the next couple of days, so do look out for that. So we will just leave it there, and thank you very much. Sorry for those who we didn't get around to answering your questions, but thank you for contributing, and it's fantastic to see everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.